Hello everyone. So you remember how I said at the beginning of the year that I would be doing monthly wrap-ups because I think they are very important. I guess I have been very lazy since the beginning of the year to do that. Maybe one of the reasons for that is that I've been reading more than usual, and every time I want to just sit down in front of the camera and talk about all the books I read in a month, there are just too many. And the number just keeps increasing with the months. So I figured if I'm going to be doing this, I better just sit down and do it. I'm planning on making this video my January, February, and March wrap-up. But depending on how long it gets, this might be divided into two parts. So let's just get into this. The first batch of books is the books that I read in January. Now, these are not all the books I read in January. I do have a January readathon wrap-up as well. And these are just the books that I read throughout January that were not part of readathons. The first book that I read at the beginning of the year was Blaze by Richard Bachman, who is actually a pseudonym of Stephen King's. This was Stephen King's last book written as Richard Bachman, and that's not to say that it was the last book he wrote physically, but it was a manuscript that was hidden away and just resurfaced quite recently in the 2000s, even though it was written way back when he was writing as Richard Bachman. It starts off with a preface of Stephen King excusing himself for the quality of the book, but it wasn't really all that bad. It's about a man with the nickname of Blaze who, due to the abuse he was suffering as a child from his father, he suffers an accident and he starts presenting with mental disabilities. The book looks at his past and how his childhood and time at a school for boys has been, and how different people have influenced his life, but it is more focused on his present when he is trying to kidnap a baby from a rich family for the reward with the aid of a con man who is his kind of partner in crime. But the twist is that he is dead. I'm not meaning this as a big twist at the end. In the first chapter, you find out that he's actually dead, and Blaze is kind of thinking what his dead friend would tell him to do. It was an entertaining read. It wasn't anything to blow my mind. It wasn't one of his best. The writing felt more like Stephen King than Richard Bachman. I would recommend it to big fans of his work, but I wouldn't say it's a pillar in his writings. The second book that I read in January, it was a book that I really did not enjoy, and I was really disappointed that I didn't enjoy it because I thought that I would love it. I had heard great things about, but I just got to the conclusion that it really wasn't for me, and that is The Wasp Factory by Iain. This book follows a 16-year-old kid by the name of Frank who lives in Scotland with his father. They're both very weird. His brother just escaped from a mental institution and is threatening to come back to the island that they live on, and basically what the book does is just follow Frank every day as he is callously describing all the tortures that he performs on the animals there and these weird rituals that he has. I can't say I hated this book altogether. I did like Banks's writing style, and I was very intrigued by the callousness of the descriptions. I was very intrigued by Frank as a character, but I just could not get past the graphic descriptions of animal cruelty. Like, there were just that many. I couldn't get past it. This is one of the few books that really made me feel sick. And there wasn't just one scene. The book made me sick throughout. The reason I say I didn't really hate it is that the writing and the character itself kept me intrigued enough to read to the end. And I did enjoy the ending, but getting there was extremely painful for me. I don't think I would ever reread this book. This is one of the books that I would never watch an adaptation of if it ever came out. It's definitely a disturbing book. It's definitely a dark book. If you're into that kind of thing, give it a go. But for me, with this book, I've really discovered that I do have a limit in the kind of descriptive things that I can read in a book. Next up, I read a nonfiction book. This one I had actually started in 2015, and it is The Psychopath Test, A Journey Through the Madness Industry by Ronson. This is a nonfiction book that looks at psychopathy, how psychopathy is diagnosed, and then from then on it goes further into just the notion of madness, how the DSM was written, and how people perceive madness, the industry of medication. It was pretty interesting. I think this is a very accessible book for people who don't have any kind of a background in medicine or psychology or psychiatry. I knew a lot of the things that were in this book just from my degree and from the fact that I am interested in this topic, and I do read articles and try to keep up with the research in the area. The problem I had with this book was I thought it was a little too broad and it didn't really focus on one aspect or the other. It wasn't focused on any of the things, it just briefly touched upon all of them in each chapter, which again, it might be very good because it is accessible, it's not too in-depth. But for me, who I was looking for something more in depth than the things that I already knew, I wasn't really super blown away by it. But I still recommend it. It is a good nonfiction book, especially for people who don't really have a lot of knowledge about psychopathy and who just have this notion that psychopaths are just murderers and they don't know what psychopathy is. It's a disorder and how it is diagnosed and who is perceived to be a psychopath. I think this is a very good book to read. Next up, I read another nonfiction. This is a very short nonfiction, and it is Bill Bryson's African Diary. When I bought this book, I had no idea who Bill Bryson was. Then I found out he has a ton of books published, a lot of travel logs, and I'm really interested to read more by him. But this was the first book that I read by him. This was sponsored by Care International. So Bill Bryson is a big writer. He writes a lot of travel logs, like I said. So Care International contacted him and proposed to him to go to Kenya and observe their projects there and write a little book about it. This is the more of a pamphlet book, it's like 50 pages, but I really enjoyed it. My only problem with it was that it was too short. The reason I really enjoyed it was that I thought Bill Bryson was very, very honest in his writing. When he goes to Kenya, he admits that all he expected there and all his knowledge of Kenya, which isn't really of Kenya, is just of Africa, because he doesn't really distinguish between the African countries when he goes there, were just images either out of Jungle Gym or out of the Out of Africa movie with Meryl Streep. And he is very honest in admitting his ignorance. And another thing that I really enjoyed about this and his writing is that he does not come out as a condescending Westerner when he writes this. He does not just describe how poor Kenya is and how bad it is and how hard of a life people have there. He talks a lot about the sites that are in Kenya and what makes the country a beautiful country, and he also talks about a lot of the locals who found resources within themselves and their country to prosper. The next book that I read was yet another disappointment. I have owned this book for many years. This is a Scandinavian book. It is called In the Flesh by Ane Schmidt. On the back it says it is comparable with Nabokov's Lolita. Now, I haven't read Lolita yet, but if Lolita is anything like this, I will be entirely disappointed. This book I found to be all over the place. This is an erotica book, and I'm not sure if it is about the author's actual experiences because the character's name is Ane as well. And I couldn't really find a lot of information about it online, in English at least. The book is divided into two parts. The first part is through her perspective, and the second part is through her father's perspective, because they do have a sort of incestuous relationship. But the reason I say sort of is because it doesn't really become clear in the book if the relationship actually exists or it's just a fantasy of theirs. The first half of the book was decent. I actually kind of enjoyed reading it, even though it still felt that the writing was a little all over the place. But the second part, it was just so repetitive, and there's no names for the characters. It's only he and she, and when she's having sex with like 20 men and she's only referring them to as he, it just gets so confusing. The book didn't really follow any sort of narrative. It was just each paragraph was describing a different event, and each paragraph was just from different timelines of her life, and it got really confusing who she was talking about and what exactly was going on, and I really did not have a good experience reading this. Those are all the books that I read in January, plus the readathon wrap-up that I already have. I'm going to be calling this part 1, and I'm going to be posting really soon part 2, which is going to be my February wrap-up, and I'm going to make a promise that I will be trying to do these monthly. So thank you so much for watching this part, and stay tuned for part 2, which is going to be my February wrap-up. Bye!